I'm Steve Wilkerson, and I'm with Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. Jim, the special session on the Florida Senate redistricting issue begins Monday. Is there a game plan emerging anywhere, like, say, in the Florida Senate, to move forward?
We're not sure. That's the short answer. The House and the Senate have put out 6 proposed maps that they could consider during this special session. And the maps, I don't know how you have 6 proposed base maps, but that's what they're calling them. Basically, the House and the Senate have agreed to go into this special session after years of legal challenges here to the 2012 Senate maps. And they have still not really said how they're going to proceed. It's very high stakes, though, for a lot of the legislators. Senators, incumbent senators, are going to want to try to protect their districts, and there's a whole lot of House members who are looking to move into the Senate and potentially in the future. So they may be looking to make sure the districts are set up for them. On the other hand, you have the fair district standards, which have driven this whole legal process and are intended to prevent gerrymandering. So we're not sure exactly at this point what direction this special session is going to go. There was a special session in August to try to draw congressional districts, and the House and Senate could never agree, and now that issue is before the Florida Supreme Court.
And that issue has taken a certain turn toward, really the courts drawing the districts, and you would think that Florida senators would prefer, particularly Republicans, based on kind of what's happening with the congressional districts, they would prefer to draw those districts themselves.
Well, that is one of the biggest questions in my mind going into this special session. In the congressional case, the Florida Supreme Court basically gave a roadmap for what kind of districts, how they wanted the districts to be drawn. But that has not occurred with the Senate districts. And as a result, the legislature's going into this special session to draw Senate districts without necessarily knowing what's going to be acceptable or not acceptable legally. So they've got 6 proposed maps that they're going to look at and use as sort of starting points. And those will probably be changed. But there's no certainty in the end that whatever they come up with is going to be legally justifiable to the Florida Supreme Court. The League of Women Voters and Common Cause and some of the other opponents who have been challenging the Senate and congressional maps for the last 3 years are going to be watching this special session very closely. They're going to analyze anything that comes out of it to determine whether it meets the fair district standards. And if it doesn't, they're going to go back to court and fight it again. So in some ways, it's a little bit of guesswork what legally will pass muster in the end. So that to me is a big difference from the congressional case, which there were court rulings that said this is what the district should look like.
You mentioned to me while we were discussing this interview that Judge Lewis, the judge who's been overseeing the congressional redistricting process, should get combat pay, which was a good comment. But bring us up to where the congressional redistricting process is right now.
Well, after the legislature couldn't reach agreement in August on congressional districts, essentially that just flung it back into the courts. And the Supreme Court said to Judge Terry Lewis, who's a circuit judge in Leon County, you hold a hearing, you make a recommendation, and then the Supreme Court will have the ultimate decision. Judge Lewis did that, and then last week he issued his recommendations, which is essentially to follow a map that was submitted by the League of Women Voters and Common Cause. Essentially, he turned down the legislative proposals. The House and Senate each had submitted separate proposals. He turned them down. And so his recommendation is now before the Florida Supreme Court, which is scheduled a hearing on November 2nd to determine whether it's going to agree with what Judge Lewis has recommended. I tend to think the Supreme Court probably will. As I indicated earlier, through the course of this congressional case, the Supreme Court sort of gave a roadmap, if you will, Judge Lewis, I think, pretty closely followed that. There was quite a bit of debate about how to split a couple districts down in Miami-Dade County that are represented by Congressman Carlos Curbelo and Congressman Ileana Ross-Layton. And there was a lot of debate before Judge Lewis about how to do that. Again, he went with essentially the recommendations of the League of Women Voters and Common Cause. So that may be an issue when it goes back to the Supreme Court. But overall, big picture, I think he probably tried to follow the Supreme Court guidance as much as possible. So I think there's a pretty good chance that what he recommended will be approved by the Supreme Court. That doesn't necessarily end the legal fighting about these congressional districts, though, because Congresswoman Corrine Brown has already gone to federal court and challenged what is going on in redistricting on Federal Voting Rights Act grounds. That case is sort of pending until everything's wrapped up at the Florida Supreme Court. But you can be sure Corrine Brown has been the biggest critic of this whole process. She's also getting help right now from Congresswoman Frederica Wilson down in Miami on the same issues. And so the congressional debate will move into federal court after it's over at the Supreme Court. But I tend to think the Supreme Court will go along with what Lewis recommended.